This is J. Harry Caufield from UCLA, presenting a poster entitled Resources for Fine-Grained Identification of Entities, Events, and Relationships in Clinical Narrative Text. So our group's primary objective in many respects is to unify heterogeneous biomedical information and to support strategies for data comparison, biomarker identification, and disease diagnosis. And though much of the diseases that our group focuses on are cardiovascular in nature, we found that in general working with certain types of literature give us information that we really wouldn't be able to find in other sources. In this case, I'm specifically referring to clinical case reports. Now, much of the work in working with biomedical information extraction, or trying to turn unstructured sources of biomedical data into structured information, works with biomedical literature as a whole. It doesn't necessarily make a distinction between experimental results or clinical reports or other types of biomedical communication. They might take PubMed as a whole. But what we found is that if we're really interested in the kind of relationships that we have with disease and their presentation, then we really want to be able to work with reports that describe those kinds of events and that is the story or the narrative about how those events go together in a document that describes them naturally. So we found that that's clinical case reports. Now, there's more than 2.1 million of these reports that have been published, at least available through PubMed. More than 640,000 of them in the last 10 years. So that's quite a bit of information, and really that pales in comparison to the much vaster amount of electronic health records that are out there. But if we look at the kind of text that we'd have in an electronic health record, there's certainly some similarities, and yet these reports are much more accessible. So these reports also have what I'd like to think are 6 other specific benefits. One is that they contain a rich degree of technical language. So this is real biomedical terminology used in the context of a real report. It's not isolated or just kind of defined on its own. They're detailed. They go into a lot of detail about medical, not only the presentation of a disease, but the therapeutic and the diagnostic procedures that were used, as well as potentially details of the patient or their outcome. So there's a lot of detail to these narratives. They're current. They're often describing emerging diseases. As we face the COVID-19 pandemic, we find that a number of the early reports of the disease were, in fact, in the form of case reports. So this is still a very relevant form of reporting emerging disease. They are chronological, that is, they describe events, usually in the order that they happened. That isn't always strictly true, but it at least follows a rough order that we can take advantage of and learn chronology about. They're also accessible, that is, that we can get to them, and yet they're domain-specific. Reports that are about cardiovascular disease contain information that's often specific to that area of disease and requires some kind of domain knowledge to understand it best. Similarly, if we look at cancer or gastrointestinal disease, then there's going to be terminology that's specific to those domains. So these are all things that we can take advantage of in designing informatics approaches. So here we also have an example of the kind of text that you'd see in one, as well as the type of entities that you'd be able to find in a knowledge base. But I want to take a moment to refer to the kind of thing that we actually did in this context. So our first step was to identify and define a full set of entity, event, and relation types that we thought would be most relevant to understanding clinical relationships that we would find in clinical case reports. Luckily, we'd thought about this quite a bit from some of our previous work, including a set that we called the MACRs, or metadata acquired from clinical case reports. So we'd already done some of the curation work, and so that was our second step, was to create even a subset of 200 clinical cases from that set that we were going to go into further detail about. And then we annotated those extensively with this set. So our set, which we called Acrobat, or the annotation for case reports using open biomedical annotation terms, contains 13 different event types, 26 entity types, 13 relation types, and even some properties that can be used to modify the event types. So by events, we mean things that actually happened or described as happening, such as the diagnosis of a disease or a diagnostic procedure being performed. Entities are other specific phrases referring to concepts. Those do include things like details about a patient, as well as relation types, and those include both chronological and modifier relationships, as well as other types of ways in which two different entities or events can relate to each other. So this ends up being a fairly comprehensive system, in our opinion. Now here, and you can see this under step 3, we have an example of what the majority of a clinical case looks like once it's been annotated with our system. Now, in our case, we annotated our 200 case reports manually using a team of 6 annotators, all who had experience interpreting biomedical language. And we accomplished all these annotations using an implementation of the BRAT tool. These were checked for consistency and completeness, and you can see that this means that we have a wide variety of different annotations that we have on here. Now, how do we think this is actually useful? Well, first of all, we're going to leave some of that to the community to understand for now. So we made it available to the community, and you can download it through Figshare. But we think that this really fits in best as a way where information extraction systems, that is, automated ones, machine learning-driven ones, can better understand clinical text, both in terms of the exact entities and relationships that they'd be able to find, but also as essentially a self-learning system where they can learn that there may be types of relationships that are particular to certain domains or entity types, and then they can use that to better predict the additional types of entities or even relationships that we would expect to see in similar documents. Similarly, we can envision a platform where you might be able to search for different types of case reports based on the things that happened within them. So with that, thank you for paying attention to my poster.